session is on the future of Discoms in a green electricity world. Electricity distribution companies, or Discoms, have long been the bedrock of India's electricity system. But Discoms and the whole sector in general is changing due to the rise of renewable energy. How will they weather this transition, and with what impacts for the reliability, access, and cost of India's electricity? This panel will discuss the pathways to making the sector economically viable in the context of a green transition. Our panelists are Raj Pratap Singh, Chairman of the Uttar Pradesh Electricity Regulatory Commission, Anne Josie, a Fellow at the Prayas Energy Group, Anish Day, Global Sector Head, Energy and Natural Resources at KPMG, and Ashwini Swain, Fellow at the Initiative on Climate, Energy and Environment at CPR, who will be moderating the session.
Thank you, Prerna, and good afternoon. Welcome to this post-lunch session. And as Prerna suggested, we are going to discuss about the future of Discoms in a green energy world. And we know electricity distribution has been an important part of Indian electricity system. And Discoms now and the erstwhile state electricity boards, the predecessors, they have been instrumental in grid expansion and access to billion of citizens and businesses in India. And they have also played significant role in terms of being representative of the state to the citizens in terms of interaction and engagement. And in the new world also, with the renewable purchase obligations, the Discoms are supposed to buy and trade renewable electricity to make the transition towards clean energy. But at the same time, with penetration of RE and green energy, the sector is changing significantly. And so is the structure of Discoms. And we are here to discuss how that's going to affect Discom as an institution, and what's the consequences for electricity service for citizens and businesses in this country. And considering the time limit, we are going to structure this around 3 broad questions. And we'll have some time for audience question and answer also. So I'll pose my question to our panelists, and we'll have some follow-up discussion. Then we'll open up for the audience. So to start with, we know Discom is important, and Discoms are right now sort of trading 80% of the electricity in India. Another 20% is directly between the generators and consumers or through captive generation. So considering that, what role we see for Discoms in the green energy world? Are they going to remain a key part of the system as a key counterparty, or they're going to be sidelined, bracketed, so that the green energy world is more market-centric, or consumers take up roles as prosumers, or there's more of captive generation or direct trade between generation and distribution. So what's your thought on that? Maybe I'll start with Mr. Singh, who is closest to the Discoms and monitoring their operational functions and role recently. So maybe we start with your response.
Thank you, Ashwini. Your question is very, very critical one, because as I see that the distribution companies, although despite they are the weak link in the power supply chain, but they have the key role to play in our whole energy transition business. And till such time electricity is transmitted through the wire, we cannot wish away the Discom's role. Even if it is open access or it is peer-to-peer energy transaction, whatever method you choose of, the role of the Discom will always be there, because ultimately it is the Discom which has to provide the electricity to the end consumer. Now, coming to managing the transition, what is happening that we are now transitioning to a cleaner energy environment through 3 Ds. The first D is decarbonizing the grid. Second D is the decentralization, where the flexible generation and distributed energy resources are getting connected to the grid. And third is the digitalization by way of, two-way communication, both information as well as power flow. decentralization, which is two-way communication, and then digitalization. Now, digitalization is equally important because we need smart grid because of the large number of flexible generating assets are getting connected to the grid. In earlier days, we used to have the load, which were base load plants, and then we had to peak load plant. But now, because of so many distributed energy resources are getting connected, this has made the whole grid operation very complex one. And in that complexity, the responsibility of the distribution company becomes very, very critical and central. So to make this transition successful, the current business as usual mode of the distribution company may not be sufficient. They have to adopt new strategies to serve this purpose. And that is possible only if they do the improvement in all the aspects of life. The first is their internal challenges or internal problems, and second is their external. The internal problem is primarily related to their governance deficit. So governance deficit and their poor collection and billing inefficiency, low ledgerization, all these challenges are causing them the liquidity problem. On the other hand, there are certain problems related to their solvency, which are, like for example, they have landed up with a high-cost legacy power purchase agreements, or they have been forced to go in for a steeper RPO obligation. There is a redundancy, there is a stranded capacity which has been created because of unrealistic assessment of the demand in the power system. So all these, and besides this, there are unregulated input to the regulated electricity business, the coal or the railway freight. They all inputs go by way of an unregulated one into a regulated pricing system. So these all challenges have to be addressed so that Discoms are technically and financially a sound body or sound vehicle which takes us in this transition to the clean energy. And if we do not take corrective reforms measure at the earliest, perhaps the pain is going to come sooner than later.
Thank you. So, yeah, as you rightly pointed out, along with the good things distribution companies have done, they also are a reflection of operational inefficiencies and the financial insolvency we see the sector. So that's why I was saying whether we can bracket those inefficiencies and losses in some way. But I understand you are suggesting that the Discoms have to evolve and change their role. Maybe Anis, if you can reflect on that question.
Thank you. No, this could have been a 20-year-old conversation or a 40-year-old conversation, depending on what you wish. Okay. So I mean, what are we trying to see? Whether these Discoms can be viable in their current form or they cannot be, especially when we are going to through the energy transition. My sense is that at large, and I'm not talking of exceptions, but at large, you don't have that possibility. And the reason I say that is that 20 years ago, we had the same set of problems and we couldn't come out of them. And now we are adding additional layers of demands to the Discoms, the RPO, banking at a very large scale, it's a balancing requirements, penalties around that. They're just not equipped to do any of that. And this is a large capital game, not just for the assets, but the trading capital, which they have to manage all of this, is very sensitive, on which they don't even have a return. Technically, they don't even get a return. And even if they had got something, it's like managing those kinds of numbers, mind-boggling numbers and obligations with the current capabilities they have would be impossible for them. Okay.
Volume.
I'll pull it closer. Okay. So if you are asking the same horse to run faster when in the first stage itself that it was lame, then I think it's going to be very, very difficult. If you have to really achieve this, you reduce the load on that entity and make it stronger for the core function which it's required to play. So in the world that we live in, and especially in the more in a world which is going to see further electrification, Discoms are not going to go away from the wires, are not going to, in the sense that the wires are not going to go away. But if you are looking to them to deliver energy transition for you by asking them to do all the things which you're doing, I think we are living in a fool's paradise. So I'll elaborate on those functions maybe down the line. But my fundamental proposition to you is that don't look at a broken thing for delivering more to you, okay, in the form of a very mission critical action like the energy transition and decarbonization, and then expect results to come.
Yeah, but if we look at the new policy proposals, and particularly the updated renewable purchase obligation, we want the same Discoms who are managing 80% of the electricity right now to procure 43% of electricity from RE sources, and which is a complex issue. Of course, we'll get into that. Before that, let's get Anne's perspective on the broader question, and we'll get into the current set of reforms.
I'm hearing green energy world and energy transitions. I just wanted to highlight that I think the energy transitions that we're talking about in the next 10 years or so will have components of low-cost renewable energy, probably viable storage, possibly even a highly economically viable storage going forward. The fact that metering technologies are getting much more viable is also part of that transition. In fact, Mr. Singh and I were having a conversation about that just some time ago. And also very critically, competition. The fact that large commercial and industrial consumers can opt for power by signing third-party contracts or by building their own plants is a definite game changer, and that is already there in the current legislative framework. So consumer choice can also be expanded to a larger ambit. And all this means that these techno-economic changes, which are inevitably happening without any sort of policy push, are going to unfold. And the question is whether the Discoms are going to be prepared for it, because they definitely have a role to play. My panelists also agree with that. They have a role to play, because and what we really need to see is what kind of system do we want going forward. If you want a system where in 10 years there is much more reduction in cost impact, there are lower resource lock-ins, there are lesser environmental impacts, and there is also pro-poor policies to protect the poor in this transition, then the Discoms have to play a role, not just as the manager of the grid, providing grid services, the entity that helps market operations take place for large consumers, but also as the entity that ensures reliable affordable supply for consumers who cannot access these market services. So those two roles have to be played by the Discom, and therefore if financial viability is a question, then we need to look at the opportunities that technology affords us in order to fix that system as well. Think of fundamental changes in order to fix that system as well, because that change is really upon us, and we need to work on that. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. So we'll get back to the question about pro-post services and other things later on. But we sort of agree that Discom has an important role to play, but they have newer responsibilities, so they have to be strengthened and pick up new roles to cope with that, if I get correctly. So the next question is, we all recognize that, and even the policy process recognizes that. So there has been a generation of reforms, legislative reforms. We have already 4 drafts of E-Act amendment discussing one currently. There is a matching set of policy reforms as well. So are these reforms or the proposals which are out in the out and currently being implemented, like even the distribution reform scheme, so are they driving in the direction of transition, or they're driving the Discoms away from transition? So the way I see these interventions are pretty much focused on 2-3 mechanisms. One is market, because the public state-run Discoms have been inefficient. So the solution to that is privatize, bring in more players. And there is at least in the current draft, even though there's no carriage content separation, there's at least an implicit focus on dividing between the wares and the supply side. And similarly, there are a lot of technological interventions, particularly if you look at the RDSS scheme, so which now recognizes that one size doesn't fit all, but it also provides a fixed menu of technological interventions to be chosen by the states. And the third thing is disciplinary actions. So are these interventions, I mean, my understanding is these are the three broad category of reforms we are talking about. Are these reforms together driving the Discom towards transition or driving the Discoms away from it? So maybe, Anne, we can start from you.
Thank you. To answer this question, we have to look back what we have done. The first generation of power sector reform started when we had, shortage of power. That means there was no generation coming up to meet our demand. So we brought that reform through the Electricity Act 2003, in which the generation was delicensed and the transmission was unbundled. And since we had done the corporatization of the electricity boards, we had left the unbundling of the distribution into carrier content for a later date. Now, subsequently, what has happened? We have to also see that delicensed and a higher return on equity and all other benefit, RTM mechanism, regulated tariff mechanism, brought in a lot of new capacity. So on the generation side, now we are surplus. And since we have unbundled the transmission, we have become self-sufficient as regards transmission is concerned. But last 4 or 5 years, since 2014, there was a proposal to separate the carrier and content, which reached up to the standing committee level. Somehow, we don't know what happened. It could not move forward. But now the next generation of reforms must include carrier and content segregation, because unless until these two, the wire business and the content business, they are segregated, no fresh investment is going to come to the power sector. And the government doesn't have the fiscal space to make the investment which is required to meet the growth in the power sector. Power sector cannot be seen in isolation as a sectoral issue. It is a multi-sectoral issue. It is linked to your economy. If you want your economy to grow, it has got bidirectional causalities. So first, you have to increase your power consumption, which goes to CNI, and that CNI gives income to the people, which raises your domestic consumption. So currently, the affordability questions become very critical. And in that respect, we have to address the new reform, the new bill which has been presented and tabled in the parliament. Unfortunately, it can be perceived as a reform bill, but it is giving rather a mixed signal. Why I'm saying so? Because in the bill, we went through the bill and analyzed it. At 14 places, the word as prescribed by central government has been used. And as we all know, this is a concurrent list subject. So basically what central government perhaps in its wisdom thinks that it has got all the knowledge and experience to control. When we are talking about the decentralization of the power system, when the all distributed assets are to be connected to the grid, making the national grid controller as the controlling body for the whole grid is not going to be technically feasible, because we know the ground situation that all the transmission substations, they don't have proper functioning metering. I checked into the peak requirement of my state and the POSOCO, there is a difference. So both are statutory bodies, but they report different peak load for the same date. So these all things are happening there, and then you are going for centralization of the grid. It is very, very risky proposition. That is number one. Number two, for reforms, you have to manage the transition, and you have to also do it through a good policy and a strengthen institution. The new bill, in fact, does not strengthen any institutions. In fact, rather it is showing some sort of trust deficit on the existing institutions, which is very, very concerning. So what I believe is that the present bill should rather focus more on decentralization and focus more on strengthening of the existing institution. Namely, first it has to start with the distribution companies. And this strengthening should not be only limited to supplying money for procurement of equipment and other. Main thing is manpower. You need to have a skilled and trained manpower. If you are going in for a smart grid system, you must have a, in UP we introduced smart metering. And we were surprised to find that neither there are good domestic manufacturers of the smart meters. One party, the government-sponsored party, takes the order. It gives, back-to-back order to 3 different companies. One is doing the software integration, one is doing and having no cyber security framework or no privacy issues. So these all things have to develop simultaneously if we want to move and adopt to a, very, very strong and, reliable grid. So in my opinion, the reforms which we are looking for to accommodate our transition to green grid. And second thing again, I cannot stop my views without expressing them. You see, there is disconnect between what we say internationally and what we say domestically. When we talk about the environment in COP26, UNFCCC, we say that environment is a national concern with differentiated responsibilities. But when we come to the domestic policies, the RPO is uniform, irrespective of the fact that my state load does not, my state UP needs peak power is required at 11 p.m. in the night. And I have to meet the same solar obligation that is of the Rajasthan. So it is disconnected. So that liberty should be left to the state and it should not be prescribed by the central government. Yes. So there is one disconnect. Second disconnect is we are giving a commitment that we'll have 50% of our sources from non-fossil fuel.
Yeah.
Okay. And domestically we are getting an RPO obligation of 43% of energy. There is capacity and here is energy. Now, the low CUF of the renewable sources translates into 70% of our capacity by 2030. I think nobody has done his homework correctly. It is as simple as that. And when you front load your RPO obligations, you'll end up with a inefficient technology for a longer generation. So these things are the issue we have to be very careful and mindful of where we are progressing. And we are trying to overdo even European counterparts. They are in fact going back on their commitments and we are front loading our commitments. So these all things will determine ultimately how we are able to achieve our transition to the green grid or whether it is going to be affordable and smooth and just and fair. Thank you.
Thank you. So you raised quite a bunch of important questions. So I have a quick follow-up question. One, you suggested that there's a governance gap, there's an institutional capacity gap, but you also said that we need to have carriage and content separation to move forward. So in terms of sequencing, what should come first? Do we focus on the governance gap, institutional capacity, incentive structures first before we bring in investment in distribution, or we can have the other first? Yeah, to you.
In my opinion, first and foremost thing is the institutional capacity building. It should start immediately. That is the precondition of bringing in any reforms. And carriage and content will not come in overnight. It is going to take some time. We need to have established the legal framework for that. And then perhaps things will be much more fruitful. But institutional capacity building is critical and central. Second thing I like to mention at this stage only, the energy needs of every country is function of its per capita income. And if we are trying to push down something much more than what we can absorb, it's not simply going to happen. And if we see the indicators, they reflect that. So even in India, if you just examine per capita income of India is say $2,200, $2,250 or $7, sorry. Yeah. And our per capita energy consumption is 1,200. Mm-hmm. So an average Indian for his average energy consumption pays roughly 6% of his per capita income. That is what it is. But if you come to the low income states like UP, my UP per capita income is less than $1,000 and my per capita energy consumption is about $650. So we pay about 7.5% of our per capita income. And if you go to OECD countries like USA, their per capita income is 69,000 and their per capita energy consumption is 13,000 units. And there, currently the tariff has gone up, but earlier it used to be between 15 to 20 cents. Now, even if you take 25, they spend roughly 3.5 to 4% of their per capita income. So it is linked with the poor ends up paying more for the energy. So that capacity and willingness will ultimately be the determining factor. And unless until it is subsidy is provided by the government to the low-end consumers, it will be a
We'll come to that. So that's in fact an important question. But before that, Anne, do you agree on the need of carriage and content mechanism? And on the broader question on the new generation of reforms, are they driving towards the clean energy world, or there could be an obstruction in the way? But I also wanted to know more on the carriage content side, because do we really need a carriage content mechanism? We already have an open access mechanism existing, which can be used for the same purpose. If the objective is more competition and choice to the consumers, that can also be achieved with open access.
Right. I think about what kind of policy and legislative framework is needed, etc. I think the question is not about whether the transition will be derailed or not, because I think many of the transition drivers are technological. I think they are going to happen whether we have policies to enable open access, to enable technology development or not, because they are being driven by technology and cost reduction. And if we look at what has happened in the past 5 years, a lot of the policy and regulatory changes are playing catch up with what is happening in the market and with technology developments. So I think the real question is, do we allow for many of these developments that are driving the transition to play out chaotically, or do we ensure that policy and regulatory frameworks are in place to minimize the cost and the environmental impacts and ensure there are no resource lock-ins in the future? Because those are the two options really before us. And in that context, I feel this question of, how do we really look at consumer choice? Because many of these developments, consumer choice is at the center. One option could be carriage and content, or this multiple distribution licensee model that the Electricity Act Amendment Bill is talking about, pretty much on the lines of what happened in Mumbai, in the state that I come from. But I think what is also very important is to see that there is already a framework within the Electricity Act for open access, which means that, and with the green open access rules, which the central government has notified, there is already an enabling framework to provide consumers who have 100 kilowatt load and above the option to sign their own contracts, as well as build their own capacity in order to meet their demand. Now what this does is, those consumers who are able to afford to use market bear the risk of market. And the Discoms don't take those power procurement decisions for them. So in a sense, it also de-risks the Discoms and shrinks the pie of their operation. Now the real challenge today is that the Discom is supplying power at 8 rupees per unit on average to a consumer. Whereas from competitive sources, power can be availed at about 4.5 to 5 rupees. Along with many other charges, for captive it might be 5.5. So there is significant savings that an industrial or a commercial consumer can make today in India. But if that procurement is done by the distribution company, and that planning is being done by the distribution company, knowing for long-term contracts, we are talking about 25-year baseload contracts, then clearly there is a huge risk being undertaken by the distribution companies, especially because these consumers might have the choice to switch between the distribution company and the market as they please, based on costs. So I think the real framework we really need to think about is if the Discoms have to operate efficiently going forward, what kind of cost compensation mechanisms can be there? If consumer choice has to be provided, then how do we really enable and strengthen the existing provisions for open access? Open access has been allowed since 2003. It's been operationalized in all states since 2008. So metering and billing frameworks, operational issues, regulatory frameworks, there have been so many adjudication issues before regulatory commissions which have established practices. So going down a route which is familiar, where we already have an ecosystem in place, might be the best path for furthering competition and consumer choice in India, rather than introducing new entities within an area of supply where many frameworks are not clear at all. So even in the Act, it's not really clear, for example, at least in the system that we have in India, it's a cost plus business, which means all costs incurred by the company can, if they are deemed prudent, can be recovered from consumers. So how is it possible for multiple licensees operating in one area of supply to sort of obtain, to be financially viable if their consumer base is the same and they have to be competitive and they have minimum and maximum ceiling tariffs, the basis of which is not clear. All of them are supposed to ensure resource adequacy, but the demand pool that they're talking about is the same. So there is an uncertainty there. So there are so many things that are quite unclear with the kind of model being proposed in the current Act. So that's why instead of looking at risky options where there is lack of clarity, it might be better to stick with systems where well-established practices are there.
Sure, thanks. I mean, that's valid, but the question is, even though we had a open access regulation and the provision is open, the quantum percentage share hasn't really grown. It's hovering around 10% for last decade or so.
Right. So, okay, so there are two issues here. One is open access may not have grown at all, but that's because of some of the charges that are being levied, regulatory charges, whether it is cross-subsidy surcharge or additional surcharge. But we can see a significant growth in captive, which is legally exempt from both charges. And there is about 35% savings for a captive consumer today. And whatever data is available, there's very little on how much captive consumption is there in the country. There is at least a 5 to 7% growth per annum in captive consumption. So that is quite significant, and that is probably the route many consumers will go for. But the other option is also behind the meter. So even with solar costs coming down and with storage becoming more viable, many consumers may find it cost lucrative to set up, have units with solar and storage and meet some of their demand during the day. So the dependency on the distribution company going forward will reduce, because the amount that it costs them to go for these kind of business models will be comparative to the tariffs that they pay to the distribution company. So they can even bypass existing stops and checks and procedural barriers that are there today to sort of prevent them from going for alternate modes maybe 5 years down the line. And that is something we need to be prepared for.
So, yeah, in a way, we are hearing that the Discom role has to shrink in a way. If we go carriage content route, it will be more of wire business to the Discom, and supply goes to new operators. And the other model could be where business consumers, industrial consumers, they switch to captive generation. Then also Discom operations shrinks in terms of the pie. I'll go to Anish now. Your reflections on that.
Can I comment on those first, maybe? Yeah. Because it's very interesting to hear both Mr. Singh and Ann speak about some of these things, and I agree with lots of that. I have some disagreements with some of those aspects as well. But just to your point, Mr. Singh, about when the law proposed has 14 Trojans, then actually they're no longer Trojans. It's very clear that the intent is to control, and I think that's unfortunate, because in a federal structure you cannot control. What you should be providing is the superstructure, okay, a whole frame, a superstructure, and then actors have to play out. We are just getting into an excessively intrusive and controlling mentality through law and institutions, which unfortunately is going to cause grief only. I hope better sense will prevail. But just coming to open access itself, see, even when the changes in the law are proposed, the fundamental premise of that is actually open access, except that instead of a corporate, it will be another supplier who will be using open access, or another licensee, because it's not a supplier, right? The new licensee has also the obligations to set up wires if it is required, and each of them, all the licensees in the same area, are obligated to provide each other access to networks, which is open access. So open access is the fundamental design construct of the Electricity Act 2003, and we just need to take it forward. The question then comes back on whether the current Discoms, are able to or capable of carrying out some of the functions, or whether they should shrink and go to things which they can manage better. Now, what are the functions? I've counted 7, which I've just made notes of as we were speaking. The first is, of course, the wires function, which is all we understand. The second is procurement and trading, and which they struggle with. The third is the supply function, and related to that is the fourth, which is customer service. Both of them, they struggle actually. The Discoms struggle. They are just supply chain managers rather than customer service providers, or real supply manager bringing supply innovation. The fifth is on metering and technology. Now, there could be, of course, issues, as you mentioned, about a single aggregator palming it off, but the fundamental thing is that the Discoms are unable to use metering and technology effectively. They have so much of data, they cannot use that effect. Who has that kind of prized information which everybody, you just let it pass? The sixth is on innovation. Now, innovation is defining whole of Indian society except the electricity system where it comes to this, and that's because we are kind of throttling innovation. It's a network business, and any network in today's world is massively a thing for innovation. UPI, in effect, is a network. It's a virtual network. We're talking of ONDC, The networks themselves can become massive source of innovation, whether physical or virtual or some combination, And that's not happening in electricity because we have these kinds of institutions. And the seventh, if I had to count, is the subsidy management, financial transfers management, which happens not just to end customers, but also to the industrial large users through banking and others. These are transfers which are happening. Now, out of all of these things, if you see, the Discoms are actually poorly placed to manage most of them. I suppose that only the first one, the wires function, you say that they are engineers, they can manage that. My point would be that then let them manage that. Let them get skilled in managing that, focused on managing that, give them the resources, give them the RDSS, whatever they need, the thing. Let them manage that. And let the rest of it play out either through open access or through another licensee, but even that is fundamentally open access. So it's very important for the law to create the superstructure of this operation, and then let the whole innovation, the markets, everything play out. We are not doing that. We are just being excessively intrusive into everything. And that just won't work. It'll just come to grief, or at the worst thing, what will happen is that it'll delay some of these essential things which you require around customer choice, around energy transition, really making renewables happen, which the world needs, which we need. We need it for not just for, the energy part of it. We need it, or decarbonization. We need it for energy security. We are so badly exposed on energy security. So we need all of that to happen. So if that is the case, then you need to fix the conduit, which is the wires. And I would suggest that we get it simplified, dummy it down, get it down to the point where that part can be simplified and can become the superstructure for all of the other things which I said have to happen. That should be the focus. It's unfortunately not the focus.
That's right. We need a superstructure, and then in our past work also we pointed out, because the states vary, we need to give the freedom to states to decide their course of reforms. So which was somewhat reflected at least in the RDSS document, where they recognized the uniform approach doesn't work for each state, so we need to provide flexibility. But then there has been several other changes where the center, as pointed out, has been trying to capture certain responsibilities. It's true that the state has haven't been able to improve electricity significantly over 2.5 decades of reform. But then that doesn't mean transferring responsibilities from center to state is important. Mr. Singh wanted to reflect on that. If you...
No, actually,
earlier
I
discussion.
wanted to rejoin what they had said.
Yeah.
Actually, this whole power business it cannot be seen from only either engineering aspect or economic aspect or political science or any single lens. When we are talking about open access, from legal perspective, we have to be mindful that open access has to be non-discriminatory. That means it has to be provided to all. And the threshold which has been provided by is 1 megawatt. So if you are talking about providing energy to the consumers through open access, you should think whether 1 megawatt consumers are there or not. They are very limited 1 megawatt consumers, number one. Number two, Government of India has provided the framework of providing 100 kilowatt open access for renewables. So that raises the legal question. I am not challenging. Someday somebody will challenge it. That there is discrimination on 3 counts. The first count is that you are changing this 1 megawatt to 100 kilowatt through where subordinate legislation. Is it legally tenable? Yes or no? Everyone knows that top is the constitution, then is the legislation, and rules are subordinate legislation, and so are the regulation. So through rules, you cannot override the provisions of the act, substantive act. That is number one. So discrimination number one is that you are changing from 1 megawatt to 100 kilowatt. Second is that non-discriminatory to whom? The generators as well as the consumers. Now, when you are making an exception to the renewables, that means you are saying that if you are in the queue for open access for a conventional power plant, then you get reset and the renewable will come and take over. So will it sustain the legal framework? Only time will tell, and maybe 5. In the process, what we are doing, we are delaying the reforms and will take 4 to 5 years till such time these issues are settled by the highest court of the land. So what we are trying to do is very, very, in a clumsy manner. And that should not have happened. The reform should start from the policy and legislative framework first, and then subordinate legislation should follow. But here we are doing it the reverse way. Now coming to the issue of renewables, and it is marketed by everyone that renewables are the cheaper. Yes, renewables are cheaper as regards their generation cost is concerned. But the grid integration cost makes them much more expensive because there are associated costs related to the grid integration of renewables because of its geospecific location wise and there is the intermittency and variability. So if you add all the costs, because grid has to be constantly balanced, and when the sun goes down or the clouds come in, immediately the generation dips or the wind doesn't. So what you have to do, you have to balance the grid on an instant basis by keeping your plants on a standby. That means there are hydro or storage or any other source which is running with a high ramp rate to balance the moment it goes off. And those standby is like, you are idling at the red light and waiting for signal to come. These all have got cost. Plus, your installed capacity is 400 gigawatts. Your peak load has never exceeded 210 gigawatt for less than 2% in the year. You are paying so much of a standard capacity cost, which your economy, if it is able to withstand, and then you are adding steeper. The estimate says that the standing cost exceeds more than 1 rupee for every megawatt of RE which is injected. Number one. Number two is that these all costs add and make the renewable much more expensive. Free ISTS is what? Under what provision? On one point, you are saying that we should eliminate cross-subsidization. And free ISTS is something like which is unfunded mandate reforms act of the United States, where they say the central government is not funding this. This is going to the consumer, poor consumer. And when it comes to the consumers, you said this, for the industry, stop. Don't give any cross-subsidy. But here you are cross-subsidizing yourself. In fact, if you see the rules, they are, if someone who knows the subject, he will immediately find out what is happening. On the green hydrogen, one of the most inefficient sources of transition, where the round-trip efficiency is less than 50%, the end-user consumer is being given ISTS waiver. Yeah. So, which is never heard of. You don't give subsidy or cross-subsidize on the end use. So these things will make the transition very, very difficult, cumbersome and expensive and delayed. That's what I'm saying. Network business, he talked about. All other network in the country are run on carriage and content. Telecommunication, gas distribution, TV broadcasting, you name any distribution except the power system. So that's why I'm saying that is the only way forward. There is no other way forward. And I'm sorry, I forgot your question in the process of my reply. What was your question?
No, you wanted to reflect on Anne's point, so that's fine. But thanks for bringing up the cross-subsidy issue, and that's somehow in the news also. Yeah, I mean, the Discoms have this social agenda of subsidizing the poorest, providing electricity access to farmlands. So that is something we cannot wish away. So that demand for subsidy will remain. We also need to, if we need to have food security, we also need to subsidize agricultural electricity consumption. Then the question is, considering we need so much of our technological advancement to meet the transition requirements, meet the green requirement, how do you balance between the two agendas? Or one of them will come at the cost of other?
Can I just comment on that, because you mentioned Discoms have the social agenda. Discoms don't have the social agenda. Government has the social agenda.
But
Okay. And Discom is the vehicle for that social agenda. Unfortunately, that's where the crux of the problem is. So we need to make the social agenda, we need to maintain the social agenda, which is not a question. We must have that. You cannot have disruption, you cannot have excessive high cost inputs going in there, exposure to different market conditions which those segments cannot bear. But there are different vehicles for doing it. There are different methods of doing it. And I think the earlier we get to those methods to transparent rather than burdening the same institution over and over and over again, I think this will be better. So I just wanted to clarify that.
yeah, precisely. I agree with that. In fact, the Discoms are the vehicle for maintaining that social agenda. But then the question is, what are the options available? I mean, there was a prescription for DBT, direct benefit transfer to the targeted consumers, but that didn't fly for various reasons.
Yeah. So T.L. Shankar, 20 years back, had proposed the framework where he had said that if you have that social agenda and if you have assets which you have at your end which can help you manage the social agenda, pair them up. Okay, now whether that is the most efficient use of, say, he was mentioning hydro assets, we could look at other categories of assets. We could look at earmarking assets or a portfolio of assets which would meet that agenda at a cost point which the government could bear, and the government is the owner of many of these assets. So there is absolutely no problem in doing that. But do that transparently. Do that as a specific thing so that you can separate the commercial elements from the non-commercial elements, which are social elements. So I think this is very, very important. In fact, in the superstructure which we talk about, those are the points which we should have come. This is my agenda. These are the 5 things. What is the government trying to look at? First, I mean, all these energy transition, decarbonization is actually way down in the government's agenda. The first of them is energy security, honestly. At this time, energy security is hugely important. Second is employment. Okay. Third is related to that is investments. Okay. Keep going down, and then you will finally come to this energy transition business, okay? And logically so, I can understand that, okay? But then you create a superstructure through the law or the policies, which are actually aligned to some of them, while letting the rest of it play out. I think that's where we are going wrong. We are trying to do too many things, too many people confused with what we are trying to achieve. The narrative being sometimes, different, as he mentioned, Mr. Singh mentioned, at the national level as well as at the international levels, the narratives being different. You're not acknowledging what your priorities are and acting on them, and that's where the problem is.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I mean, ideally, it's a good way to handle aligning your agenda and assets. But then there has been different innovations also. So at least there's a proposal for farmers, there's a proposal for having a separate agri-discom where these entities will harness the cheap solar power, and there we don't have a load balancing issue. The solar demand could be met in the daytime. And solar feeder model, which Maharashtra and others are doing, those are options. Then the other option is also providing infrastructure subsidy. I mean, even enabling poor to go, not exactly go off grid, but harness the potential from cheap solar power. So I wanted to have your reflection on those options. What are the options? How do you balance this?
I think I want to, I'm very happy to see this reflection in the panel that all of us seem to agree that renewable energy can stand on its own economic proposition and doesn't require some form of concession, because all of us talked about cost compensation for grid services for the distribution company rather than having renewable energy related subsidies, whether it's for ISTS, whether it's for banking. So I'm very happy to sort of share that, this is very important, that on one hand, Discoms should be allowed to charge services, for its services at cost when those services are being provided. I think that's very important. So I just wanted to talk about that first. I think with respect to the social agenda, I think there are two aspects that I'd like to reflect on. I think moving towards a low-cost green system is also part of the social agenda. And I think it's not just about provision of subsidy and having pro-poor policies. That's very important. But moving towards a system where, majority of our power is coming from renewable energy, where we pilot storage systems so that by the end of the decade, we do have other options for grid integration and for ensuring a reliable supply rather than building new coal plants. That's also part of the social agenda. And I think decisions by state governments, by distribution companies today can make a big difference in that. So I think we really need to think about having more storage pilots. We really need to think about how we can meet at least all new demand through renewable energy. That is techno-economically possible. We had done a study in Maharashtra looking at a production cost model where at least by 2030 that was the most cost optimal option along with grid integration costs to have 50% of the demand met through renewable energy in the state like Maharashtra, which is even higher than the central government's renewable energy target. So states and a distribution company should also think of that as part of the social agenda. And when it comes to the pro-poor, I don't see those two also in conflict. There are many options and opportunities where using technology could also be there to solve many of the issues, as Ashwini was saying, whether it is with looking at megawatt scale solar plants, at dedicated agricultural feeders to provide daytime supply to farmers. Now, provision of daytime supply to farmers has been an issue for decades and decades, and with technological intervention that is possible. Another intervention is with respect to having AMR and AMI metering on all feeders. Now, for many years, we've been talking about how energy accounting is becoming a challenge, but now regulators are able to use this AMR, AMI data to really at least get a better understanding of what are the energy losses in agricultural feeders where consumer metering is becoming a challenge. Then we could also think about having storage need not be only for, let's say, something to do with solar co-generation, co-located with solar or for transmission deferral. One could think about having storage for rural hospitals, storage for primary health centers to provide reliable supply for essential services. So those kind of technologies can also be piloted to ensure that some social agendas are being met, such that these technologies are also upscaled. So these are the kind of thoughts that were coming to my mind. Or even virtual net metering. One issue that keeps coming up is for public bodies. They're unable to pay for the electricity supply that is given to them. And typically, if it's a normal consumer, the distribution company will disconnect their supply if there is non-payment of bills. But for consumers, especially public bodies which are providing essential services, that is not possible to do, or emergency services. So having some sort of methodology or mechanism for having virtual net metering such that the power is generated by a solar plant and it is net off by the consumption that these units do will help improve the collection efficiency because the bills are sort of net off. It will help improve the kind of collection that the Discoms does, improve their financial viability, and also ensure that these consumers are not disconnected or are able to provide supply. So I think we should think on those lines when it comes to the social.
Thanks, Anne. So, Mr. Singh, also this social agenda is not equally distributed across the states. I mean, we have subsidy demands concentrated in fewer states, I mean, higher demands concentrated in fewer states, and UP is one of those states. Considering that, your reflection on how this agenda can be balanced at the state level, or how the Discoms could mediate that both the agendas.
As she mentioned, and I agree with her, and we have done it. Like, for example, to meet the social agenda, what we have done, we had allowed net metering to only those consumer categories whose tariff is less than the A cost, namely the domestic and the agriculture. So whatever they generate and consume actually is a win-win for the Discom as well as the consumer. So that is how we can, that is one way of doing so. And in our state also, 2 years back, we did a pilot on peer-to-peer energy transaction, whereby, the solar energy prosumers, the rooftop solar prosumers, they were allowed to sell their surplus power to the other users who are willing to buy. And definitely there is win-win, because the solar prosumer was getting a feed-in tariff which was less than the tariff of the price which he is going to get from the new buyer, and the new buyer was buying at a higher rate of a commercial or industrial tariff category. So that has in fact given us very encouraging results. So these are some of the innovations perhaps we can think of in making this balance. But till such time the Discoms are able to make this break even, ultimately is the state. The need aspect of the consumer has to be the state responsibility through subsidy, and the demand aspect, which is need plus desire, that aspect has to be paid by the consumer. So with this philosophy only we can make the Discoms a viable one. Now coming to DBT also, now and then there are murmuring about introduction of DBT. DBT is not going to help the Discom in any way. What it does is basically save the government subsidy bill, which is actually efficient utilization of public resources. So, but the government is also very smart. The nature of this electricity commodity changes with time. Before election, it becomes a political goods or maybe a social goods. And after the election, it becomes economic goods. So, everyone gets confused at what sort of pricing framework we have to use. So these things needs to be answered before we perhaps take a very, very firm view on that. But state has to come forward and meet the subsidy requirement of the poor consumers. That is required. Otherwise, the Discoms will remain, because there are solvency issues in the Discom tariff structure.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, that's one of the big questions we need to settle, whether electricity is a public good to be provided by the state to every citizen, or it's a economic good. But that's a big question to answer. With that, we have about 15 minutes. We can open the floor for any questions.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Vikram Gandotras. I think some faces are familiar. Sir, I don't think we can find a better panel than what we have on the stage today. We are talking today about the new Electricity Act and what it's going to have the impact on Discoms. As some of you have rightly also pointed out, the current legislation by itself, if it is properly implemented, would help in making the Discoms more efficient. Unfortunately, sir, you have also rightly put that the institutional and the manpower is a very big problem. Now, unless that is done, whatever we do in this new legislation, electricity amendment, whatever carriage content, we will only compound the problem more. That is my personal view. And in fact, it is not just the Discoms who are at blame, even all the regulators, leave aside maybe UP, Gujarat, Maharashtra, I mean, I'm openly naming few, but the rest of the country is in totally different world. So how do you propose, sir, that this can be handled? And if today you say that there are these 14 so-called Trojan horses in the new amendment, we should also try to see from the central point of view also, central government point of view also. They have drained lots of money over the years and they find that nothing is happening, the horse is still dead and they're, they're getting frustrated in my opinion. So unless we find a way that the states or Discoms themselves, by way of governance, even the leadership, I mean, it starts from the leadership of the Discoms. I mean, I'm sticking my head out, but that is the reality. And if that is not changed, as much money we might put, as many new laws we might bring in, there's not going to be much difference. And when we look at the alternative, that is of privatization. Yeah, I have read, sir, many of your views. You have, not been in favor of that. But if you ask anybody in this room who has been a resident of Delhi, what it was before 2002 and what it is today, I don't think anybody would say that they would like to go back to the previous time. So
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, we got the question.
So my questions to Mr. R.P. Singh and sort of related to what the gentleman was saying. See, there's no question about this issue, the need to strengthen Discoms, which is the point you brought up, Mr. R.P. Singh. And the future is going to be much more challenging for these. I mean, if it's bad enough now, it's going to get tougher for the Discoms, both in terms of operation and planning. And so, but there are two ways of strengthening the Discoms. One is we can try to strengthen these state-owned Discoms by trying to improve their expertise and so on. And the other way is to privatize distribution licenses. And see, because in the first one, we don't know what if the incentives are right. But with private distribution companies, the incentives are right. But, there are political problems. But if we did it not all at once, but the way the government had initially proposed, but if you do them one state at a time, learning as you go along, and start with the worst performing ones. Could you talk a little bit about they're both difficult issues to do, both are difficult ways to do it. Could you talk a little bit about what are the relative advantages or disadvantages? How challenging is one a little easier than the other and so on?
Thank you. Actually, replacing a public monopoly with a private monopoly may not be a very good idea. Because ultimately, what we land up is a monopoly, and the monopoly has got its own. The only solution is to bring in competition. Now, competition can come only when there are more than one player with right incentives. The examples which are quoted are of Delhi and Mumbai, only big cities. So far, private monopolies are operating in big cities where the consumer mix is paying, where ABR is sufficiently, lucrative one, and there is no subsidy burden. If you see the experience of Orissa, which was the first one to go in for privatization, we know the outcome. And now, finally, another private firm has also taken up. So when you compare what gives them the advantage, why a private firm has gone and taken up the whole of the state of Orissa, I think we have to wait a couple of years to come to a conclusion. But one thing I can clearly say, it is the regulatory framework which provides, some incentive or disincentive. Now, the model which is proposed in the bill which is before the parliament, it basically promotes cherry picking. What it says is that you can be a distribution licensee without owning an asset. And it also says that your area of supply may not match. It may be less than, it may be more than. And it may be even across two distribution companies. So basically, that is a cherry-picking business without any universal service obligation. So that model I'm totally not relying on. What I am relying on, say for example, I was talking about Orissa. The difference between Orissa and UP is that last 4 years ago, we changed our regulatory framework. And we are having a normative trajectory loss post-Uday. We said whatever you have committed post-Uday, you have taken the benefits. Now you cannot come back to us and say that our AT&C losses are still high, so please allow us that. Because public money has been spent, and we are paying ROE in our equity base, and if you are not meeting, there has to be some accountability framework. So we have given them a trajectory, and now whatever they achieve is not our concern. We allow them only 11% AT&C. In Orissa, the normative AT&C is, as per actual, which they say it is 21%. So here is the cream. The private parties will go where the regulators allow higher AT&C, because the potential to make money lies with the AT&C, because they can improve billing and collection efficiency and make money. The model which is in the bill, he is a wireless operator. Basically, he doesn't have any asset. And the bill talks about regulated tariffs, ceiling and floor. You know, regulated tariff cannot be split into ceiling and floors. It will have only one, number one. Number two, you have to, in a regulated tariff, you have to give return on equity. On what equity base you give return when his investment is zero, even he is not bringing in his own meter. So these things, and it talks about you set up a cost reflective tariff based on expenditure incurred or whatever. Now incurred is historical, tariff is prospective. So somebody should do his homework properly. This is what I have been saying. Well, when you draft a legislation, try to address something, don't create legal confusion which will end up in litigation.
We can take up a couple more questions because we have 5 minutes. Does anyone want to respond on the first question?
Yeah. No, I just wanted you to reflect on your sort of global experience on these grid integration studies. Do you really think grid integration is a higher cost option going towards larger and larger share of renewables, given what you're seeing around the world and given where the financial markets are, what they are willing to underwrite, not willing to underwrite, and the pipeline of projects that we have on conventional technologies? So no matter what the policy directive is on 40%, 50%, do you see higher shares of renewables really posing a much higher cost techno-economically?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you were speaking about an energy transition which really means that you will move from a conventional energy generation mix to a largely renewable energy mix. Now, are you taking into account other transitions which are being planned? For example, the Transport Ministry says that we will move to ZEV vehicles. We are going to completely phase out fossil fuels and so on and so forth. And everybody is quoting 2030 as some magic time. That will cause an exponential increase in demand. And do you think that renewables will be able to meet that demand, and the unpredictability of how that demand is going to work over a 24-hour cycle? Have these things actually been taken into consideration? Is anybody thinking about all these problems in a more holistic fashion?
Sir mentioned Odisha. Before we know which private company has taken over the distribution, Enzin was responsible for, as a franchisee, for 3 circles in Odisha. And the main problem we faced was that we were given stringent targets to meet as far as technical and commercial losses are concerned, but we did not own any asset. Now, how were we expected to bring in that kind of investment? So the same thing seems to be going on. And my concern is, are we learning anything from these kind of experiences as far as coming up with, better improving distribution?
Thank you. Anish?
Yeah. So on the first one, Ashwin, to your point, what happens globally as well as in India is that till a point, you can use the diversity of various resources to get to a high level of balancing of and along with load shapes. So if you are looking at one-on-one matching of assets, it will never happen. Once you are able to take the same category of assets from multiple locations as well as different categories of assets when solar combination, till about 75–80% you can get there very well. After that, it starts getting very expensive. Now, that's where storage innovation will come in. Today, we are seeing some possibilities, including for the production of hydrogen and others, the off-river pump storage becoming a viable option for some of these things. And I think there are some very interesting developments and models being played out over there. So we should keep that eye open for innovation. And while Mr. Singh has a correct point to say that today it is expensive, but today we are expensive because we are trying it in a very conventional, through a very conventional lens. We are not using the lens of innovation in that. So I think once you start doing it, it is good enough, not complete, but that completion will come in 5, 6, 7 years' time. Just on the question of whether the EV demand and other demands have been taken, they've been partially taken in the studies. The National Electricity Plan and others take that partially, not a full conversion, or even if a full conversion happens, there's a stock of ICE vehicles which will continue over there. So there's a transition there. My worry is that we are banking a lot on hydrogen, but I haven't seen the hydrogen demand being considered in any of these studies till now. But maybe there's something happened which I'm not aware of.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Singh, if you can respond to the Odisha question.
No, you are right. Unless until there are two aspects to your question. First is whether you reduce the AT&C losses. The technical aspect requires the investment, and the commercial requires only the governance aspect. So the technical one depends upon the length of your network. What is your length of the network and the voltage, low voltage to high voltage ratio and all those things. For that, you perhaps need to make investment. And even if you don't make investment, it is still manageable. It can bring your technical losses. You can bring your technical losses to the lowest of the double-digit figure. But it is more of the commercial losses which do the damage to the distribution companies' liquidity problem. And if you are not able to achieve or bring it down, then obviously there is a governance issue, and that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. And
I just wanted to quickly respond to some of the questions. Daljit, about your question about privatization, I think more than whether it's private ownership or public ownership, I think whether the regulation allows for cost plus or not is very important, because if all prudent costs are passed through, then essentially there is no incentive for efficiency improvement, whether they are private or public. And the second is whether there is competition across the value chain. Many of the private utilities that we have been tracking in the country also, they basically sign contracts, power purchase contracts, mostly with their sister concerns. So it's not like when they are operating as private entities, they're really fostering the spirit of competition. So I think maybe we should think about fostering competition rather than, and looking at better efficiency rather than talk about private versus public. About the point about electric vehicles, I agree that in general, there is a piecemeal approach to looking at transitions, and maybe more states should think about having integrated energy policies, factoring in many of these aspects. I think that's extremely important at the state level. And there, many of these opportunities can also be capitalized. Many of these innovations can also be thought about. And we also are having an initiative with CPR and WRI to track some of these transition-related changes that are happening in states across transport, buildings, electricity, to try and see what are the planning issues that are there, what are the governance issues that are there, regulatory and policy challenges, so that states can learn from each other and we can go forward as well. So I just thought I'd point that out.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks everyone for your time and insights. This is useful, and we are out of time now. Thank you. We close over here.